There are things a man carries his whole life that he never quite sets down, not because they're too heavy, but because they remind him who he became and how close he came to being nothing at all. I was 63 years old the autumn my granddaughter asked me why there were still jam jars in the library. She'd been dusting the shelves, moving between the tall oak cases her grandmother had commissioned from a craftsman in Denver, running her cloth along the spines of books bound in calfskin and linen. And there, between a volume of English poetry and an atlas of the territories, sat a single jar of preserved plum, dark and amber gold behind the glass, sealed with wax gone the color of old honey. I told her the jar had earned its place. She looked at me the way young people look at old ones when they sense a story coming that will take longer than they'd planned to hear. I settled into my chair by the window, where the afternoon light comes across the orchard just right in October, and I told her to sit down, because some things deserve to be told from the beginning. It was the spring of 1887, and the valley south of Pueblo, Colorado, had just come through a winter that tested everything a person thought they understood about endurance. The snow had come early and stayed late, and when it finally released its grip on the hills, it left the ground soft and uncertain, the way grief leaves a person, outwardly healed but unstable underfoot. She had inherited the estate from her father the previous September, not a ranch in the rough-handed sense. It was a proper estate by frontier standards, with a main house of 12 rooms, a stone carriage house, 2 working barns, a bunkhouse, and 40 acres of orchard that her father had planted 20 years before, with a patience that bordered on religious conviction. He had been a man of vision and careful habit. She was his only child, and she had her father's eyes and her mother's absolute certainty that the world could be made to behave if you approached it with sufficient will and organizational clarity. She was 31 years old and had spent most of her life in St. Louis and Philadelphia. She had read widely, dressed well, and kept meticulous household accounts in a hand that would have impressed a bank clerk. What she did not know, what no ledger or finishing school had ever taught her, was fruit. She did not know that an orchard is not a decoration, that 40 acres of apple and plum and pear will make demands of you every single season, without negotiation, without sentiment, without the slightest regard for what you had planned to do with your inheritance. Her father's foreman had quit in January. His 2 remaining hands had followed by March. The trees were budding now, indifferent and expectant, and she needed someone who understood them. That was how the advertisement came to be written. She composed it herself, standing at the writing desk in her father's study, choosing each word with the same deliberate care she gave to a household budget. She wanted someone experienced, someone honest, someone who would not drink the cider brandy her father had stored in the root cellar, or sleep through the morning work, or disappear the first week of August when the harvest pressed hardest. She did not write any of that, of course. She wrote, "Orchard manager needed, experience required, references preferred, wages fair, apply in person at the Ashford property, 12 miles east of Glenwood, Colorado. Ask for the house." She nailed it to the post outside the feed store herself. The man at the counter watched her do it and said nothing, which she took as a sign of respect. It was, in fact, a sign that he had already heard about her, about the Eastern woman who had arrived with 14 trunks, a temperament like cold iron, and not one practical skill the territory could use. 3 men came in the first week, and the first smelled of spirits before noon. The second could not name a single variety of apple, which she found disqualifying. The third was 64 years old and told her plainly that he could manage the orchard, but that his knees would not survive another Colorado winter, and she respected him enough to thank him honestly and send him away with a jar of her father's preserved peaches from the cellar shelf. Then came the 4th. He arrived on a Wednesday in late April, on foot, with a canvas pack over one shoulder and mud on his boots that had dried in the particular way. Mud dries when a man has walked a long distance without bothering to clean it. He was not large in the way she had expected an orchard man to be large, not broad and loud and full of boasts. He was spare and quiet, with hands that were calloused in specific places she did not yet know how to read, and eyes that moved through the orchard the moment he arrived, slowly, the way a careful reader moves through an unfamiliar text. He spoke first about the trees, not about wages, not about the bunkhouse, not about himself. He walked to the nearest row without asking permission and stood under a young maiden blush apple and looked up into the canopy for a long moment, then crouched and pressed 2 fingers into the soil near the root line and said something very quietly, in what language she could not tell, before standing and turning to face her. She asked him where he had come from. He said a long way. She asked him if he knew apples. He looked at the tree beside him, then at the 40 acres stretching east in the afternoon light. Swen said he knew them better than he knew most things in this country. She told him to start Monday. He started Monday. She watched him from the upper window of the house, the window she had always thought of as hers, the one that looked east over the orchard rows, the way a captain's window looks over the sea. She had watched her father walk those rows. She had watched the men her father hired walk them. She knew the difference between a man who was working and a man who was pretending to work, and she watched this one to find out which he was. He worked, not with the frantic energy of a man proving something, but with the steady, unhurried motion of a man who had done this long enough to know that hurry was its own kind of waste. He moved between the rows with a short-handled pruning knife she had not given him, his own, so she realized, worn smooth at the grip. He pruned nothing that first morning. He only looked. He crouched at root lines. He lifted low branches and examined the undersides of leaves. He pressed his thumbnail into small patches of bark and leaned in close to see what the color told him. By the afternoon of the 2nd day, he had found the canker. She had not known there was canker. The trees had been declining for 2 seasons, and she had told herself it was the dry summer, or the hard frost the winter before, or simply the ordinary grief of aging trees. He came to the door in the late afternoon with his hat in his hands and told her, plainly, without softening it, that 7 trees in the eastern quarter had fire blight, and 3 more were at the early edge of it, and if the infected wood was not cut away before the new growth pushed in spring, it would move through the whole block. He told her the tools he would need and how he intended to sterilize the blades between each cut so the disease did not travel on the iron itself. She looked at him for a long moment. She asked him how he knew. He said he had seen it before. She asked where. He said the old country had apples too. It was the most she would get from him on the subject for some weeks, and she accepted it the way one accepts a partial answer when the partial answer is, itself, useful. She told him to do what was needed. She told him the tools he asked for would be at the barn. That night she sat at her father's desk with the ledger open and did not write in it for a long time. She had hired men before who knew the name of a disease without knowing the cure. She had hired men who knew the cure, but applied it too late, or too roughly, or not at all. This one had found the trouble she had not seen, named it without drama, and laid out the remedy in plain terms. She did not yet know what to make of that. The next days belonged to the orchard. He was out before first light. which she knew because she rose early herself, and could see the lantern moving among the rows before the sky had made up its mind about the sun. He worked methodically, without haste, the way a man works when he has thought a task through before lifting a tool. She watched from the kitchen window with her coffee going cold in her hand. He would stop at a tree, examine it, decide, and either move on or set down the lantern and begin. So the cuts were clean. She could tell, even from a distance, that he did not hack or wrench. He removed what needed to go and left the rest undisturbed. By the third morning, she had stopped watching and started working alongside him. Not from any sentiment. She told herself it was her orchard and she had a right to understand what was being done to it. She asked him to walk her through the signs of the canker, how the bark looked where the infection had taken hold, how far below the visible damage one had to cut to find clean wood, how you knew the wood was clean. He showed her without condescension, which she had not expected. Most men explained things to her as though the explaining were itself a burden they were generously bearing. He simply showed her and let her draw her own conclusions. And when she drew them correctly, he nodded and moved on. She began to understand that he had a feel for the trees that went beyond technique. He would press his palm flat against a trunk and hold it there a moment before deciding. She asked him once what he was doing. He said he was listening. She thought about asking him what he heard, then decided she did not want to seem foolish, and let it go. The weather turned sharply colder in the second week, which worried her. A hard frost at the wrong moment could undo everything they had done, shock the freshly pruned wood, invite further disease into cuts that had not yet calloused over. She mentioned it. He was quiet for a moment, then said they could protect the most vulnerable trees with burlap if she had enough of it in the barn. She had some, not enough. He said he could manage with what she had if she showed him which trees she valued most. That question stopped her. She had not thought about valuing individual trees. To her, they were the orchard. He looked at her as though waiting, not impatient, simply ready. And she realized she was being asked to make a distinction she had never made before, between what was irreplaceable and what could be replanted, between what she was willing to lose and what she was not. She walked along the row for a moment. Then she stopped at one older tree near the eastern fence, one her father had planted, and put her hand against the bark without quite meaning to. He saw her hand rest against that bark, and he did not say anything for a long moment. So then he walked to where she stood and looked at the tree, the way a man looks at something he is trying to understand rather than merely assess. He touched one of the lower limbs, ran his thumb along a scar where an old branch had been lost to wind or weight, and nodded slowly, as though the tree had told him something she had not been able to put into words. "That one first," he said, and she nodded. They moved along the fence line together after that, and she found herself pointing to others, not with any great logic she could have explained, but by some feeling she had not known she carried. "This one too," she said, "and this." He noted each, remembering without writing anything down, which she observed. When they returned to the barn for the burlap, he cut it into pieces with an economy of motion that suggested he had done this before, or something like it, in some other orchard in some other country she had never seen. She did not ask. She had stopped asking about his past in those direct ways. She had learned that what she needed to know about him, she would learn by watching him work. The wrapping took most of the afternoon. He showed her how to secure the cloth so it would breathe and not trap the damp against the wood, how to leave the collar loose enough that a thaw would not cook the bark inside its own cover. She worked beside him without being asked to. It was practical. 2 sets of hands finished faster, but it was also something else. She was not supervising. She was not inspecting. She was working in the cold, with her sleeves rolled and her fingers red, and she did not mind it. The frost came that night. She lay awake listening to the silence deepen. It's that particular silence of a temperature dropping, when the air seems to press down against the earth and hold everything still. She thought about the trees in their burlap, the old ones especially, the one her father had planted, and she felt something she was reluctant to name, because naming it would mean admitting how much she had been holding back from this place, from caring too openly about something that could still be taken from her. In the morning, the ground was white, with a thin, hard frost, and she dressed quickly and went out before breakfast. He was already there, walking the rows, checking each wrapped trunk with his hands, touching the cloth to feel if the cold had gotten through. He looked up when he heard her boots on the frozen grass. He did not smile exactly, but his expression settled into something calm. And they had held, he said simply. She looked out across the orchard, white and still in the early light, every wrapped tree standing quiet in the cold. They stood there a moment in the pale morning light, the two of them, looking out at what they had kept. She did not say much, neither did he. There was something between them now that did not require words, the shared knowledge of a thing almost lost and then not lost, and she found that she was grateful for his presence beside her, without quite knowing how to hold that feeling. Breakfast was late that morning. She did not care. She made coffee strong and poured 2 cups without asking, and set one on the table near where he was pulling off his outer coat and hanging it by the door, and he took it with both hands and drank it slowly, standing at the window that looked toward the orchard. She watched him look at those trees the way a man looks at something he considers his responsibility. Not his property, his responsibility. There was a difference, and she was beginning to understand it. The frost had spared them, but it had not been generous. Several of the lower branches on 2 of the older trees had blackened at the tips, the cold finding the unprotected ends and leaving its mark. He pointed this out to her after breakfast when they went back out to unwrap the cloth from the trunks now that the morning sun had lifted the temperature enough. He showed her where to cut, explaining in his careful, deliberate way that a clean cut healed better than a broken one, that leaving dead wood invited illness into the tree, that the tree would not miss what was already gone. She found this observation sitting in her mind longer than she expected. She had brought her good pruning shears, the ones her father had kept sharp on a leather strop hung by the barn door, and they took turns. He guided, she cut. Occasionally she guided, and he cut. There was no ceremony to it, no performance, only 2 people working a row of trees on a cold October morning, with the sun coming up behind thin clouds and the frozen grass softening underfoot as the hours passed. The guests she had invited were coming in 3 days. She had nearly forgotten. When she remembered, standing in the orchard with bark dust on her coat and her breath visible in the air, the thought arrived not with its usual anxiety, but with something flatter. She would have to go back to the house and think about the library, about the impression she intended to make, about all the arrangements she had set in motion to show a certain kind of life. But standing here, she found it difficult to care about that with quite the urgency she once had. She looked sideways at him. He was studying the next tree in the row, running his hand along a branch, and he had not yet noticed her looking. She turned back before he could. The guests arrived on a Thursday, which that year fell with unusual coldness for late October. She had spent the 2 intervening days in the house, directing the arrangement of flowers she had cut from the last of the autumn border. pressing the good tablecloth, reviewing the library once more with a critical eye. The books stood straight and orderly. The oil lamp on the reading table had been polished until the brass base caught every available light. She had done what she could, and she told herself it was sufficient. He had spent those same 2 days in the orchard, finishing the pruning alone, and she had not gone back out to join him. She noticed this about herself, without quite explaining it. It had been easier, out there among the trees. In here, with the good tablecloth and the straight-standing books, she felt the old familiar pressure return, the sense of being observed, of being measured by the life she had assembled around herself, rather than by anything she had actually done. The guests came in 2 carriages, 4 of them altogether, her father's old solicitor and his wife, a woman who had been her closest companion during her schooling years, and a gentleman rancher from Pueblo whose opinion her father had always valued without ever quite saying why. They arrived together as if they had arranged it, which they probably had, and they came inside quickly against the cold and filled the front hall with coats and comments about the road. She brought them through to the library first, as she had planned. The solicitor ran his finger along a spine and nodded. His wife exclaimed at the drapes. Her old companion stood near the window and looked out toward the orchard with a mild expression that was difficult to read. The gentleman from Pueblo said the room was finer than he'd expected, which she understood was not entirely a compliment. She was watching their faces, measuring the small increments of impression, when she heard the sound from the kitchen passage. A low, heavy rolling sound, wood against stone floor, followed by a dull clank of metal. She recognized it. One of the copper kettles. She kept her expression still. He had told her 2 mornings ago, while they worked side by side on a stubborn upper branch, that he intended to begin the first full kettleful before the end of the week. The overripe fruit would not keep. She had said nothing in response, which she now understood he had taken as permission, or at least as the absence of objection. The gentleman from Pueblo turned toward the kitchen passage. "What is that, if I may ask?" She drew breath. She had a prepared answer, something about the harvest stores, something that would smooth it over without requiring any explanation at all. But she hesitated a half-second too long, and in that half-second, the door at the end of the passage swung open, and the smell of warm sugar and cooked fruit entered the library like a slow tide, sweet and undeniable, reaching every corner of the room before anyone could decide what to make of it. The smell did what words could not. It moved through the room without apology, warm and heavy and entirely out of place among leather spines and polished mahogany. And every face in the library turned toward the kitchen passage as though pulled by a single cord. She watched them turn. She watched their expressions shift. The small frown from the gentleman's wife, the raised brow from the banker, the almost imperceptible tightening at the corners of the gentleman from Pueblo's mouth. None of it was hostile exactly. It was something worse. It was confusion edging toward amusement. She set her hands at her sides and stepped forward. "He is working," she said, and the steadiness of her own voice surprised her. "He keeps his own hours with the harvest." That was all she offered. No apology, no elaboration. She had learned, in the weeks since the orchard began to fail and the kettle work began, that elaboration invited argument. Silence invited only silence. The gentleman from Pueblo looked at her for a moment longer than courtesy required. Then he turned back toward the shelves and resumed his examination of the volumes. And the room, by some collective agreement, chose to follow his lead. But the smell did not recede. It deepened, if anything, as the minutes passed. a richness she had not anticipated, something in the combination of late-season fruit and raw cane sugar and the slow copper heat that produced not merely a kitchen odor, but something almost ceremonial, the kind of scent that belonged to church preserves or a grandmother's back pantry. She found, against her better judgment, that she did not entirely dislike it. The gentlewoman beside the window leaned toward her companion and murmured something. Her companion smiled, not unkindly. She crossed to them. "Plum and early pear," she said quietly, before either of them could speak. He began with the plum. "He says the color sets better in copper." The gentlewoman looked at her with what she could only describe as honest interest. "Does it? I'm told so." She paused. "I had not considered it before." There was a brief silence between them, not uncomfortable, and then the sound came again from the passage. Not the rolling of the kettle this time, but a steady, rhythmic wooden knock. The long-handled paddle working against the bottom of the pot, slow and deliberate as a clock. She had heard it every morning for 11 days. She had grown, without meaning to, accustomed to it. The gentleman from Pueblo rejoined the group with a volume in his hand, some matter about the bindings, and the conversation shifted back to the library, to the shelves, to the occasion she had planned for and prepared and arranged with care over the better part of a month. She answered his questions. She spoke about the collection. She was present and composed, and said every correct thing. But her attention, a small and traitorous portion of it, remained with the sound from the kitchen. The guests stayed through the better part of the afternoon. She walked them through the reading alcove, the atlas cabinet, the row of botanical volumes arranged by continent. She answered every question with the ease of long practice, the kind of hostess she had been trained to be from childhood, and she did it well. She had always done it well. The library was beautiful. She knew it was beautiful. She had ordered the shelves built to her own specification, had argued with the cabinet maker over the depth of the molding, had chosen the brass fittings herself from a catalog that arrived from Philadelphia. Standing in the middle of it with a glass of lemonade and 3 people asking earnest questions about bindings, she ought to have felt proud. She felt instead like a woman listening through a wall. Sure, the sound from the kitchen passage had stopped sometime during the second hour, and the silence where it had been was louder to her than the conversation in the room. She found herself tracking the absence of it the way you notice when the wind drops and the whole yard goes still. She caught herself twice glancing toward the hall. The third time she did not glance. She simply excused herself with a quiet word about refreshments and walked out. The kitchen was empty of visitors, which was the first thing she noticed. The second was the smell, plum and sugar and something warmer underneath. A depth to it that came from the long, slow process rather than from heat alone, the way a good thing earns its richness. The copper kettle sat on the iron range, its contents a deep and serious violet, and on the table beside it stood 6 sealed jars in a row, cooling in the slant of late afternoon light that came through the window. She had never once thought of as anything but ordinary. He was at the far end of the table writing in his notebook. She had not known he kept a notebook. The pages she could see from where she stood were covered in small, careful figures. Temperatures, she thought, or times, or measurements of some kind. He did not look up when she entered, which she found surprisingly, not rude, but simply like a man who trusted that if something required his attention, it would make itself known. She stood for a moment without speaking. Then she said, "The color?" He looked up then. "The color of the plum," she said. "You were right about the copper." He regarded the row of jars. She looked at them too, the deep violet catching the window light like something stained on purpose, something deliberate and considered and quiet. "It will be the same for the apple," he said, "when the time comes." She did not know what to say to that, so she said nothing, which was its own kind of answer. She set down the cloth she had been carrying. She had not even remembered picking it up, and pulled a chair from the side of the table and sat. Not across from him, not at the head where she had always sat when the table had been used for correspondence and ledger work and the receiving of bad news from bankers. She sat to the side, close enough to see the notebook without reading it, close enough to see that the figures were indeed measurements, columns of them with small notations beside each that she could not decipher from where she sat. "What does it say?" she asked. She meant the notations. He turned the notebook slightly so she could see without craning her neck. The writing was very small and very even, the kind of hand that had learned itself under difficult conditions, a hand that had no room to be careless. "The bricks," he said. "The sugar content. I measure it before I pull the fruit. Too early and the set is weak. Too late and the flavor goes flat." He touched one column with the end of his pencil. "This is the plum. This column is the temperature at which I held the boil." He moved to the next column. "This is the time." She looked at the columns for a long moment. She had spent the better part of a decade managing this land. Its debts, its seasons, its endless negotiations with weather and men who thought her incompetence was charming. She knew what a ledger looked like. She knew what serious record-keeping looked like. This was serious record-keeping. "You have been doing this since the beginning," she said. "Since before the beginning," he said. "Since I was watching what we had and trying to understand what it could become." She sat with that for a moment. Outside, the dry wind moved through the orchard the way it had moved every evening since midsummer, persistent and unimpressed by anything planted in its path. The trees had given what they could give. The fruit had come, and much of it had been caught, and now it sat in jars along the cellar shelves in colors that no drought could touch. She reached out and turned the nearest jar slowly in her hand. The light moved through it. "The apple," she said. "When do you expect it?" 3 weeks, he said, "or perhaps 4 if the nights stay warm." She set the jar back among its companions and looked at the row of them, and then at the notebook still open between them, and she thought, not for the first time, but more clearly than before, that this man measured things worth measuring. The apple harvest came in 3 weeks and 2 days, which he noted in the ledger without ceremony, though she caught him watching the trees the morning they began to turn, and thought she saw something like satisfaction in the set of his jaw. Not pride exactly, something quieter than pride. The recognition of a thing going the way it was supposed to go. They picked for 4 days straight. She worked beside him, which surprised him the first morning. She could see it in the brief pause before he handed her a basket, and which she suspected had not been what he expected of her when the season began. But she was not the same woman who had stood at the door of the library with her hand at her throat, watching copper kettles come through it. She was not sure she could explain the distance between that woman and this one, except to say that the orchard had taught her things, and the cellars had taught her things, and the ledger laid open on the table had taught her something she would not have learned any other way. The apples were good. Even in a dry year, even with the creek running shallow and the soil cracked along the south-facing rows, the trees had held. He had known they would. She understood now that his knowing was not guesswork. It was the kind of knowledge that comes from watching carefully for a long time, from understanding what a tree needs and what it can endure, from refusing to confuse what you hope for with what is actually there. She found herself, on the third evening of picking, standing at the end of a row and looking back at what they had done together. The baskets were full. The light was going gold and flat across the grass. Her hands were sore in a way that felt honest. He came to stand beside her without speaking, and for a while neither of them said anything. The ranch was quiet in the way it was only ever quiet at the end of a long working day, when every part of it had been used and was resting. "The apple butter will go fast," she said finally, "if the orders hold." "They will hold," he said, "and there will be more orders than that. I've been writing back to the grocer in the city. He wants to see the full inventory before winter." She looked at him. "You have been corresponding with grocers." "I have," he said. "I hope that was not presumptuous." She thought about what presumptuous had meant to her once. It had meant overstepping. It had meant a man acting as though he belonged somewhere he had not been invited. She looked back at the orchard. "No," she said at last. "It was not presumptuous. It was right." He nodded just once, and she understood that with him a single nod carried the weight other men would have spent a paragraph spending. They walked back to the house in the long autumn light, and she noticed, not for the first time, but more clearly than before, how he moved through the property as though he understood it, not as an owner understands a thing he has purchased, but as a man understands a place he has tended. He knew which gate latch stuck. He knew which board on the porch steps gave a hollow sound and needed shimming. He had learned all of it without being told, the way a person learns the habits of someone they have decided to stay beside. Winter came early that year, with a cold that moved down from the north in the first week of November and did not leave until spring. But by then the shelves were full. The cellar held more than 100 jars: apple butter, plum preserves, pear conserve with a thread of spice that had been his own addition, cautious and correct. The grocer in the city had placed his order and then doubled it. 2 dry goods stores in the county seat had sent letters of their own. The library still stood at the center of the house. She had come to see it differently. The shelves held books still and always would. She had not surrendered that. But one long table near the south window held the logbook where orders were recorded in his careful hand, and the ledger where she entered what each jar had cost to make and what each jar had earned. The copper kettle sat in the corner, polished by use rather than ornament, and she had stopped apologizing for it, even in her own mind. She was not the woman she had been when he arrived. She knew that. She did not think she had lost anything essential, only certain arrangements of pride that had not been serving her. On a morning in January, with snow on the ground and the fire going well, he set a jar on the table in front of her. The label was written in his hand, the orchard's name and the year and the variety of fruit, neat and plain. She picked it up and looked at it. "This one you should keep," he said, "not for selling." She set it on the windowsill where the light could find it. I have told this story more times than I can count, and the part that stays with me is always that jar on the sill. Everything they built together was in it: the hard season, the ruined harvest, the man no one expected, the woman who learned to let someone stay, gold in the glass, and all of winter still ahead of them.